website. Good afternoon and welcome to the latest lecture of the World War II Discussion Forums Fall series. Before I introduce this afternoon's speaker, I want to briefly cover the usual housekeeping items. First, our speaker has graciously agreed to take questions after his prepared remarks. You have two ways to ask a question. You can either use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and I will read out your question to our speaker, or if you prefer to ask your question directly, please use the raised hand feature at the bottom of your screen and I will call on you to unmute your line. Regardless of the method, please be respectful of our speaker and the audience when asking your question. We'll take about 15 to 20 minutes of questions and go to about 2 p.m. New York time. Second, donations are always appreciated. There is a donate tab on the website. Third, as I mentioned, we now have a YouTube channel. I think we've had the last 10 or so talks recorded. The icon to access it is at the top of the website. Fourth and finally, you can send any feedback through the website at wwiidf.org. Now, this afternoon's speaker, and someone I'm absolutely thrilled to have, is a phenomenal World War II historian, and I think I literally reached out to him over a year ago. Saul David is a historian, broadcaster, and author of several critically acclaimed works of fiction and nonfiction, including World War II. His history books have been shortlisted for the Westminster Medal for Military Literature and variously named a Waterstone's Military History Book of the Year and an Amazon History Book of the Year. He co-hosts the Battleground podcast with Patrick Bishop. This afternoon, Saul will discuss his latest book, Tunisgrad, Victory in Africa, which offers a comprehensive perspective on the campaign, told from the perspective of all the combatants and ranging in focus from politicians and senior commanders to ordinary servicemen fighting in and over the mountains of Tunisia and across the Mediterranean. As a personal note, the breadth of the book is fabulous. I'll just embarrass him with two quick reviews. James Holland, writing in the Daily Telegraph, says, I romped my way through this fascinating book, which fully does justice to a pivotal moment in the Second World War. Saul David writes with verve, pace, and drama aplenty. His chapters rattle along breathlessly. There's plenty of astute judgment to boot. Tunisgrad is terrific stuff. No less a figure as Richard Overy writes, an enthralling narrative, rich in detail, along with fine pen portraits of the principal actors. Saul David has done a welcome service in reminding us not to neglect a 6-month campaign that ought to be better known. And with that, I will turn it over to Saul.
Thanks so much, Gregory, and thank you very much for having me on. I'm just going to start with the first slide, and this is the Führersonderzug, Hitler's special train. And the reason I'm showing that is because on the 8th of November, in the early hours of the 8th of November, Hitler was on this train with his high command staff heading from Berlin to Munich in southern Germany when the train was stopped in the Thuringian forest for an urgent message from the Foreign Office. And the message basically read, American troops are disembarking in French Algeria. Now, this was a tremendous shock to Hitler. He'd been warned by senior people in his operations staff that this was a possibility. French North Africa, of course, at this point was controlled by the Vichy regime, which were technically neutral, but in reality under the thumbs of the Germans. And what it meant, of course, if Western Allied troops, particularly American troops, were going to land in North Africa, they would be in a position to squeeze Rommel's Panzer Army, which at that time had been recently defeated in the Battle of El Alamein, which ended on the 4th of November, so just 4 days earlier. And of course, there was a fear among the Germans and Hitler too that that army would be caught between a vice, between these forces coming in on the west and, of course, Montgomery's 8th Army, which had just defeated it at El Alamein. Just shortly after he got this news, Joachim von Ribbentrop got on the train. He was, of course, the foreign secretary, and said to Hitler, listen, under the circumstances, given that the Americans are now in the war in the West, I think we need to do a deal with the Soviets. And Hitler was absolutely determined that that wasn't going to be the case. Weakness is not a time to come to terms with the Americans, so that's not going to happen. His next question to his high command was, what can we actually do about the situation? What forces have we got available? And the answer, of course, was none. So his conclusion to all of this is we may not be able to stop them getting into Algeria and also into Morocco. So they were invading on those the two of the most western North African colonies. But there was an opportunity to get them into Tunisia. Now, I'm going to show a map in a while, which will give you a sense of what's happening with Operation Torch. But before we go to that map, just give you a sense of strategically what's happening and why the Western allies have chosen to go into North Africa in the first place. Here's Rommel, of course. I just mentioned that his army had been fighting in North Africa. There's Monty, who defeated him. That's the Battle of El Alamein, which had just taken place, kind of relatively brief graphic. And here's the map that's relevant. So those three locations, the Eastern, Center, and Western task forces, are where Operation Torch was landing. And you can see that Tunisia is an opportunity this was the third of the three colonies in French North Africa, but this is a chance for this is an opportunity for the Axis forces, that of course is the Italian forces, but also the German forces, to get in and stop the Western allies from getting all the way to Libya. You can see Libya down in the bottom corner of the map. So it was really a race who can get troops to Tunisia as quickly as possible. The reason, by the way, that the Western allies had only gone as far as Algiers, because they couldn't trust that air cover would be effective any further closer to Sicily, where, of course, the Italians and the Germans had a lot of planes. So that's why they stopped at Algiers. I promised I'd fill you in with a bit of the grand strategy. Well, the decision was taken to go to North Africa as a result, of course, of America coming into the war, which was Pearl Harbor. And at that stage, the overall grand strategy had already been agreed with the British. It had been agreed a few months earlier, and that was to defeat Germany first. You defeat Germany and then you turn on Japan. But the question was how you're going to go about it. And the American chiefs of staff were convinced the best way is to go straight into Northwest Europe. The British chiefs of staff disagreed. If we go into Northwest Europe now, when the Germans still have 60 divisions and they're still pretty strong even on the Eastern Front, it's going to be a bloodbath, and we don't have enough troops and landing craft in Britain yet to do that. So we need to delay at least until 1943. The place we can cause the most damage to the Axis is North Africa. Why? Because it'll destroy the Panzer Army. If we can take the whole of the North African seaboard, we can open up the Mediterranean to shipping. That will save 1 million tons of shipping that has to go all the way around Africa to get to the fighting in the Far East. We'll be able to use the Suez Canal. That will save a lot of shipping, and this is going to be useful everywhere. But we're also going to open up Southern Europe to an attack at any point. And this is going to force the Axis to leave a lot of troops defending the Southern Europe. And thirdly, and arguably most importantly, there's a real chance, if it's successful, it will knock Italy out of the war. So those were the plans. Here's one of the generals. It's amazing the number of senior and famous generals involved in this operation. And here's one of the most famous, and that, of course, is Patton. And Patton was in charge of the what was known as the Western Task Force, which landed at Morocco. And that went pretty successfully. So do the others at Algiers and also at Oran. There was a certain amount of fighting, and it does take 2 crucial days for the Western Allies to take control of these important ports. And this gives the Germans enough time to get troops into Tunisia, in particular to Tunis and Bizerta, those ports in the north of Tunisia. And effectively, the race for Tunis is ultimately going to be won by the Germans. And I'll give a little bit more detail about that in a moment. Here's the capture of Oran, and you can see there is a considerable amount of fighting. In classic fashion, you land on either side of a port, and then you advance in and capture it. And that's what happened at Oran. But a lot of fighting took place there. It also takes place at Algiers. And here's the key man in the early stage of Operation Torch, Admiral Darlan, who was commander-in-chief of all Vichy armed forces, who took these 2 crucial days before he finally agreed to do a deal with Eisenhower. I'll tell my troops to stop fighting, and you can move across French North Africa if, in return, you let me stay in control of both politically and the armed forces of French troops in North Africa, much against the fury of the Vichy authorities back in France. Who, of course, are about to be supplanted by the Germans, who will now occupy the whole of France. But in any case, in North Africa, Darlan does this deal, and this releases troops to try and capture Tunis as quickly as possible. The man in charge of this is Lieutenant General Kenneth Anderson. Omar Bradley only comes into the story a little bit later. Anderson's not a hugely experienced British general, and it's a bit of a mystery that he's given command of the so-called First Army, which had under its control the US Second Corps. Originally about 50,000 troops land, and their job, as I say, is to get to Tunis and Bizerta as quickly as possible. But Anderson's a bit of a ditherer. He's not a great, he's a bit of a micromanager too. And the forces that he's actually able to put into play against this man, Walter Nering, who's the German commander who's sent to Tunisia, are not that great. And it's about 15,000 against about 15,000. And here's the so-called race for Tunis. And you can see that in this graphic, what the Western Allies are trying to do. They're coming from Algiers. They're also dropping various airborne drops at various locations, including Tabessa, quite close to Tunis, also Beaune, where they capture the airfield. There were plans to use commandos to get behind the German lines, but they're ineffective. And what actually happens quite quickly is that the Germans are able to set up a series of blocking positions. They take advantage of the fact that they've got airfields very close to the scene of fighting in Tunisia, and the Western Allies don't. And the end result of all of this is that Kenneth Anderson loses the race, for Tunis. And so by Christmas 1942, by which time the Western Allies had hoped to have captured all these locations, they are still fighting. They're held up to the west of Tunis. And so the campaign is now going to descend into, or carry on into 1943. Anderson, a measure of the man, blames the Americans, says they won't listen to his orders. They're inexperienced. He was throwing his toys out of the pram, and it was badly done. And there was a certain amount of bad feeling between the different nationalities. It took time for them to understand how each type fought. There were some interesting armored engagements during the early stages of the fighting close to Tunis, in which the Americans actually do quite well. They knock out a whole column of German panzer tanks. And there's an assumption that the panzers, the German tanks, particularly the Mark IV and the Tiger Mark VI, are much superior to the American tanks. And tank for tank, they probably were, but the Americans ultimately, the British Western Allies ultimately had many more tanks. This is just a quick picture of two para who were fighting in Tunisia and were frittered away like a lot of the airborne troops. They drop once, they're not supported, and they're badly knocked around. And so we move towards the end of the year, and Ike Eisenhower is very, very keen for the campaign to be completed as quickly as possible. He's overall commander-in-chief of Operation Torch, and here he is in discussion with a man who's going to play an important role in 1943, General Sir Harold Alexander. He'd done very well in Egypt. He was commander-in-chief of the Middle East for the British, and he was brought in under Eisenhower to act as ground forces commander. And under him, he's going to have Anderson with First Army. He's also going to have Monty with Eighth Army, who has been, while this early fighting has been taking place, the Panzer Army, Rommel's Panzer Army, has been withdrawing ever closer to Tunisia. And what you're eventually going to get by early 1943 are the two German forces, that is Rommel's Panzer Army and the 5th Panzer Army, which is under the command of a man called von Arnim, who's taken over from Nering. Those two armies are going to join forces. And Harold Alexander's job is to coordinate the Western forces, the First Army, US 2 Corps. There's also a French force, which is not that effective because it doesn't have very good weapons, but it is used to fighting in Tunisia. And of course, you're going to get Eighth Army. So it's the agglomeration of all these Western Allied forces. And Alexander's job is to begin to coordinate their command. But before that takes place, I'll move on from Logstop Hill because we don't really have a chance to talk about that. But before that takes place, the Germans have plans of their own. And here is one of the senior German commanders, Hans-Jürgen von Arnim. He's commanding the 5th Panzer Army, as I say. Most of his experience has been on the Eastern Front. He's nowhere near as good a tactical commander as Rommel. Pretty much a safe pair of hands. And I think if the Germans are going to look at the lost opportunities in the Tunisian campaign, it's that Rommel was never given overall control over all the forces in North Africa until it was too late. Effectively, what you had is two Panzer Army commanders running their own shows and not coordinating properly. And that, in my view, was a big mistake. We've got an interesting moment in the middle of the Tunisian campaign, and that's the Casablanca Conference. That's significant for a number of things. One, of course, it's when the Western Allies agreed on unconditional surrender. It's also the time at which they agree that the D-Day is not going to take place in 1943. Again, they still don't have enough troops in the UK. They don't have enough landing craft. So better to take advantage when they capture the whole of North Africa to advance into southern Europe, and the plan is to go into Sicily sometime in the summer of 1943. But obviously, they've got to capture North Africa first, so the pressure is on Eisenhower to get there as quickly as possible. But as I say, the Germans have other plans. And here's the man in overall command, General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring, who was theater commander for the Germans. And he has under him Rommel as commanding his army, and also von Arnim. And Kesselring's broader plan is to use his two forces to destroy the two converging Western Allied forces, one after the other. And he's going to take on the First Army first. And there's a good reason for that, because the First Army is heavily strung out on these two mountain ranges in the center of Tunisia, known as the Eastern and the Western Dorsal. And you can see those kind of two defensive positions lined up there on the two mountain ranges. And what Kesselring realizes, and Rommel also realizes, if we can break through both those weakly held lines of defenses on the eastern and the western dorsal, and then drive up from the western dorsal all the way to the north of Algeria to the coast, we can completely cut off the lines of communication for First Army and the US Second Corps, and effectively this will be another Dunkirk. And once we've done that, we can turn on the Eighth Army, which, if you look at the bottom of the map, is down at a location called Medellin, and we can defeat the Western Allies one after the other, or in detail, as military people would have it. And it was actually quite a clever plan. So I don't have enough time to talk in huge detail about what goes on, but I'm sure a lot of listeners will have heard of the Battle of Kasserine Pass, but you might not know of another battle that took place even earlier, and this was on the 14th of February at a place called Sidi Bouzid, which you can see right in the center of the map. Now, the Germans had captured Faid Pass from the French on the 30th of January, and they then launched this very clever pincer attack on American forces, both the 1st Armored Division and the 1st Infantry Division, the famous Big Red One, but both are relatively experienced at this stage of the war, and they are taken by surprise in this lightning pincer attack by the Germans on the 14th of February. The forces that take place in this initial action at Sidi Bouzid are actually members of von Arnim's 5th Panzer Army, so this is not Rommel. He's going to come into the story in a second. Incredibly successful attack. They isolate, they destroy a lot of American armor, and they also isolate a lot of infantry on three hilltops, which are now behind German lines. And so there's an attempt the following day on the 15th for more American armor to relieve those positions, and that attack fails. It's defeated, and it's badly defeated. Now, it's at this point that Rommel says, well, von Arnim's done quite well, but he should take advantage of this victory by keep going and try and get through the second western dorsal, this second range of mountains. But he doesn't. He pauses for 36 hours, and this gives the Americans time to regroup. And when there is a battle at Sabaitla, which takes place a day later, and the Americans have got enough forces there to be able to repulse the initial German attack. And these, just a day pause is enough. Now, meanwhile, Rommel, who's basically said, okay, give me all the panzer forces you've got, and I will break through the western dorsal and head all the way via Tebessa, and you can see that right the way to the left of the map, and then head all the way north, so similar to Kesselring's plan. But he's told just before the action, one, you're not going to get all the armor, and secondly, your new axis of advance is to Le Kef. Now, Rommel writes later, in fact, in the summer of 1944, after he's been badly injured in Normandy, this was a real missed opportunity. If I'd stuck with my original plan, we may have destroyed First Army, and who knows? But what happens next is his attempt to break through at Kasserine. He initially captures Gafsa, and then he moves on to Feriana and Thalepti airfields. So these are all captured from the Americans without a fight, because they withdraw. And they withdraw back to these two passes at Sabiba and Kasserine. And there's a double attack put in by Rommel on the 18th of February. And that initial attack is rebuffed in both locations. It's interesting. People often think of Kasserine as a disaster. Well, for a day and a half, the American troops, and there are only 2,000 of them, particularly at Kasserine, fight very well. There are British forces helping to defend the Sabiba Pass, and they fight very well for that first day. But on the following day, Rommel very cleverly doubles up on the Kasserine Pass battle by getting all the troops that he'd been using against Sabiba to now reinforce the Kasserine fighting. And by the afternoon of the 19th, they break through. They break through Kasserine Pass, mainly because the American line completely disintegrates. And they're now through both passes, and here's a real opportunity to roll up the Western Allied line. The reason it doesn't happen is twofold. One, this pause in fighting, it's taken the Germans too long to break through both passes. And secondly, the Western Allies have managed to bring reinforcements down from the north, and they are heading from the direction of Le Kef down south towards these locations which are threatened. And this is ultimately what Rommel blames for his rebuff. That is the fact that he doesn't actually get all the way through to the north. And that's because his new axis of attack towards Le Kef brings him headlong into the face of these reserves coming down from the north. And it's also true that the Americans fight particularly well in their defense of the, this is a two-pronged attack by let me see if I've got a map here. Yes. So you can see the map here. In the center of the map, that's the Kasserine Pass. And once Rommel's got through, he launches a twin attack, one which is heading towards Tebessa and one heading up towards Le Kef. And both of those are rebuffed in a very successful defensive action, which takes place on the 20th and the 21st. And so in a relatively short period of time, even though Rommel and von Arnim have had a lot of success, they've advanced 80 miles, they've captured 4,000 men, and they've destroyed 200 American tanks and armored vehicles, they nevertheless are forced to withdraw. And so all of that success actually isn't for any great purpose in a strategic sense. And it's at this stage, here's a quick graphic of American troops coming back through Kasserine Pass to give you an indication. And this picture, by the way, was taken on about the 23rd or the 24th of February. So even though the pass has been in German hands, it's now relatively quickly recaptured. So what you now get is Rommel doubling down on his original plan. So he was going to try and defeat First Army. He's sort of given it a bloody nose, but he certainly hasn't defeated it and he hasn't destroyed it. And now he's going to take on Montgomery. I think this battle was a big mistake. I mean, ultimately, of course, the result of it would indicate that. But I think it was a big mistake because Rommel in his own heart must have known he wasn't going to be successful here. He had 3 panzer divisions, which were all the German armor in North Africa, but they only had 160 tanks between them. Normally, they'd have had about 900 if they had their full complement. So they simply didn't have the striking power needed. If you look at the map on the left of the graphic, you can see, you know, a series of really quite sophisticated hammer blows that they're attempting to use against Monty's position at Medellin. But Monty had a brilliant plan, a defensive plan at Medellin, and that was to locate 400 anti-tank guns in hidden positions. And so when these hammer blows were made by these only 160 tanks supported by Panzer Grenadiers, they were relatively easily rebuffed, and it was another victory for Montgomery over Rommel. We'll come on to the Battle of Marath in a minute, but before we get to Marath, one thing's worth knowing is that Rommel realizes the game is up after his defeat at Medellin, and he orders a plane and he flies to Vinnytsia in southern Ukraine to meet with Hitler. And he wants to tell Hitler, and he does tell Hitler, we need to get the troops out of North Africa. We can't possibly win in Tunisia. The Allies are too strong for us. But if you allow me to withdraw our veteran forces there, and there are about 250,000 of them at this point, maybe more like 300,000 at this point, I can use them to defend the southern flank of Europe, and no Western Allied force is going to land successfully. I can promise you that. And Hitler's response is, no, they will remain where they are. I'm doubling down. North Africa is far too important, a strategic and military objective of ours to be lost. It'll be disastrous for Mussolini if he's forced to relinquish North Africa. I'm not doing it. They're remaining there. So Rommel says, fine, well, I'll go back and command them. And shortly before he left, actually, he'd been given overall command of von Arnim's troops too. And Hitler says, no, you need to go to a sanatorium to recover your health. And that's the last bit of the story of Rommel in French North Africa. So the end of the Tunisian campaign, you could say to a certain extent, the outcome is inevitable, and it probably was post-Medellin, but there's a lot of very, very heavy fighting to happen after that. The first is the Battle of Mareth, which is the 8th Army against the 1st Italian Army. That's the rebranded, it was known as Rommel's Panzer Army, but it's been rebranded the 1st Italian Army. Fights very well at Mareth, actually, and rebuffs Montgomery's original attack, but he uses this very effective hook attack, you can see, with the New Zealand Corps outflanking the defensive positions, and this enables them, or at least forces Messe, the Italian general, to order a retreat from the Mareth line, and he goes all the way back to the Wadi Akarit, which you can see in the north of the map, and that's another very, very effective defensive position. That is taken on the 6th of April, well, the 6th of 7th of April. The initial attack again is rebuffed, but there's a brilliant action by the 4th Indian Division, this veteran 4th Indian Division in the hills, and they outflank the Italian position, and so it forces another withdrawal. And then there's a further battle which takes place, and we're now into April now, about the 20th of April, and this is the fighting for Enfidaville. Again, this is the 8th Army doing all this fighting. There is fighting between the US 2nd Corps and the British 1st Army. Don't think that they're not doing anything. They are engaged in a series of actions, but they don't make much headway. It's the 8th Army that's making most of the headway, and they're gradually constricting what's left of the Italian and German forces further and further north into a defensive redoubt. And this is just an amazing location, actually. If anyone is interested in visiting Tunisia to see some of the battlefields, I would suggest you go to Takruna. And we're almost at the end of the story. And I've almost saved the best till last, because one of the most extraordinary battles fought in the whole Tunisian campaign is Operation Strike, otherwise known as the Battle of Tunis. It takes place over 2 days, really, the 6th and the 7th of May. Brilliantly planned operation in which infantry are used to capture heights along the axis of advance, and then 2 armored divisions, the 1st and 7th, the 6th and 7th, then launch their attack into Tunis. And fighting that's taken place, if we go all the way back to the race for Tunis, they get within, I don't know, 15, 20 miles of Tunis. 6 months earlier, they're finally captured Tunis in this kind of lightning action. And meanwhile, American troops have done brilliantly of the US 2nd Corps, which now is commanded by Bradley. I should have mentioned that the original commander was Fredendall. He gets sacked after Kasserine, doesn't do very well, actually. He's built himself a bomb-proof shelter in Tebessa, far too far away from the scene of the action. So he's sacked. Patton takes over, reinvigorates the 2nd Corps, does brilliantly, and then he's taken out of the command to prepare for the Sicily campaign. He's going to command 7th Army there, as we will know. But US 2nd Corps is then commanded by Bradley, and he does really well. And his forces capture Bizerta, which is the northern port, on the same day as Tunis. Here are British troops entering Tunis on the 7th of May. And this is the end game, I suppose you would call it, basically showing you the lines of advance before the final surrender, which takes place on the 13th of May. I just want to read out a couple of quotes, because they are quite telling, really, with the significance, I suppose, of the whole campaign. Here's Joseph Goebbels. This is on the 7th of May. This is the same day Tunis falls. And he writes in his diary, he, of course, is Hitler's propaganda chief, "When you think that 150,000 of our best young people are still in Tunis, you rapidly get an idea of the catastrophe threatening us there. It'll be on the scale of Stalingrad, and certainly also produce the harshest criticism among the German people." I mentioned that the end came on the 13th of May. That's when Messe, the Italian general, surrenders the remnants of his 1st Italian army. And this allows Alexander, who had been coordinating all the latter stages of the fighting, to send a single line telegram to Churchill: "Sir, we are masters of the North African shore." A couple of weeks later, Churchill gives addresses the US gives an address to Congress. First time he's done that since just after Pearl Harbor. And in that joint session of Congress, and in that speech, he says, "We have struck the enemy a blow which is the equal of Stalingrad, and most stimulating to our heroic and heavily engaged Russian allies. We have destroyed or captured considerably more than 250,000 of the enemy's best troops, together with vast quantities of material. The African war is over. Mussolini's African empire and Corporal Hitler's strategy are alike exploded. One continent, at least, has been cleansed and purged forever from fascist and Nazi tyranny." So just to sum up really the significance of the campaign, I would argue, as I do in the book, it was, along with Stalingrad in Russia and Guadalcanal in the Pacific, one of the three Axis defeats early in 1943 that changed the course of the war. Historians, as a lot of listeners will know, have recognized the significance of the first two that I mentioned, but not Tunisia, which has either been ignored or characterized as a sideshow. Yet it ended Axis sea power in the Mediterranean and destroyed more than 2,400 Axis aircraft, 40% of the Luftwaffe's total. More German and Italian troops were captured in Tunisia. That's 250,000, as Churchill pointed out, than were lost at Stalingrad. Such was the scale of the defeat that the German public wryly dubbed it Tunisgrad. Thank you very much.
Oh, Saul, that was wonderful. Thank you very much. There's already a number of questions in the queue, and they're growing, actually. I think everyone knows the directions. Either you can type it in or raise your hand. I'm just going to go right now. James Colvin, I think you've been first. If you want to unmute your line and ask your question. James? Okay, I'm going to go to James. Oh, James.
Hi, James.
Hi, how are you? Great to see you. Yeah, I mean, what elements of the United States Army training that enable them to improve their initial performance so dramatically in the Second World War, compared perhaps with the rather extended training period that the British Army, the Eighth Army in particular, suffered in North Africa?
Well, Patton, I mean, if you just take the armor for a second, I mean, Patton made his name really as a trainer and an organizer in the US. He had no experience of fighting before they get to North Africa, and he's already got the armored forces under his command. That was the Second Armored Division, the Hell on Wheels, as it was known, to a very high state of training. But what they aren't used to is the way to fight the Germans. I think their initial tactics were very poor, and they had to relearn them. I mean, effectively, they were trying to take them on in a kind of tank-on-tank action. And the Germans had already realized that's not how you fight with armor in the Second World War. You basically bring people onto your anti-tank guns, and you only use tanks when you don't have any serious opposition against you, certainly not anti-tank. And certainly, you rarely fight them in a tank-on-tank way. And I think the Americans learned very, very quickly. I mean, there's a wonderful character I didn't have time to mention in the address I've just given, but of course it's given a fair amount of room in the book, called Robinette, who Robinette's one of my big heroes of the Second World War. He gets badly wounded at the end of the fighting. He's in command of part of the first US First Armored Division, Combat Command B, as it was known. And there were three combat commands in an armored division at that time. So effectively an armored brigade. And he does brilliantly. He fights very well in the fighting immediately following Tunisia. And he's already learned that you don't send your tanks out into the open. You get them into hull down positions, and you use them with tank destroyers and artillery to knock out enemy armor as it's coming onto you. So I say the Germans never did that, but in this particular fighting, they had to, of course, because they had to come out of their shell, so to speak, to try and get in deep into the enemy rear. Now, immediately following Kasserine, which apart from the fighting with Robinette and others, doesn't go that well. There's a lot of rethinking. I think one of the things that the Americans are very good at is learning, where they went wrong and retraining as a result of that. And Patton comes in to command US Second Corps, and he really shakes things up. I mean, he improves the discipline, he improves the quality of the training, and that is, the US Second Corps becomes a much more effective force in both the fighting in southern Tunisia and also under Bradley in northern Tunisia.
Right, interesting, thanks.
Yeah, thank you, James. James Ellman, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Thanks so much for taking my question. Most people in the US seem to believe two things about the Tunisian campaign. One is that we suffered a big strategic defeat at Kasserine Pass, which I think you've already explained was not really more than a tactical defeat, and the US actually recovered and fought pretty well in the defensive soon after around Thala. And secondly is that Patton came in, engineered a victory, and basically beat Rommel. could you help explain to us why that's not in fact correct? And
Yeah,
just since you mentioned that, as I understand it, Robinette wrote afterwards that he thought very little of Patton and thought that Patton had not, in fact, shaken up discipline and really was just a martinet.
I,
And
to be fair, I think Patton did do well in giving Second Corps, its confidence back, its morale, because its morale was low as a result, particularly in the First Infantry Division and the First Armored Division, who had been badly battered, as I've already mentioned, in some of the fighting in central and southern Tunisia. But what's interesting about Robinette is he's very outspoken. He was critical of pretty much every senior US commander. If you look at his diary, which I used in the book, I can quote from it extensively. And he's his own worst enemy in the end, because I don't think he gives even people like Patton, who, were great self-publicists, but were actually quite good at certain things. I mean, Patton was brilliant when he was fighting in an aggressive way, when he had to move quickly, as we could see in the fighting that takes place in 1944. But when he comes up against very strong defensive positions, as he's going to in the Tsar in 1944 and Metz, he's nowhere near as effective a commander. But just to specifically answer your question about Patton's claim to have defeated Rommel, or at least the perception that Patton defeated Rommel, well, he certainly says, let me go literally, let me be in a single tank and I will take on Rommel. I mean, he's a great one for saying, mano a mano, I'm going to defeat that guy. Nothing wrong with Patton's courage, but the timing's all wrong, because as I'm sure the eagle eye or the eagle listeners will know, the timing never works. He's not given control of US Second Corps, so he doesn't do any fighting in Tunisia until the middle of March, by which time Rommel's already left the theater. So unfortunately for Patton, he never gets a chance to go head to head against Rommel. That was left to Monty, who's of course defeated him multiple times prior to this. So I think the really interesting question when I was writing the book is, does Rommel deserve the vaunted reputation he has? Not entirely was my conclusion, and yet he was still, a very, very effective commander, a risk taker, which, occasionally you need in war. One of the criticisms of Monty was that he didn't take enough risks. But Monty argued then and later that in the context of the war, when, the Western Allies only had a certain number of bodies, we didn't have unlimited number of men to lose. That wasn't a bad way to fight.
just one quick follow-up. In that Tunisgrad map you showed for the end of the campaign, it shows Patton in command of 2 Corps as of 20th of April. Hadn't he already left the theater at that point?
No, God, that's interesting. What date was that one? Patton is in command until the middle to late April, and then he's taken out. So he's in command of 2 Corps for a relatively short period of time, and then Bradley takes control. But yeah, I may have made a mistake with that map. But the last map, which was the map where the final fighting takes place, Patton has nothing to do with that. He's training troops over in Algeria and Morocco at that point.
So much for the time.
Great, thanks, James. Jim, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yep.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's funny how they treat Robinette, because I know after the war, he doesn't get beyond the rank of a BG.
Yeah.
After the war, they siphon him off into the office of the chief of military history, which always amused the hell out of me. But what did you learn that's new about this campaign? Because this campaign has, as you know, as you went through all the secondary sources and the primary sources, this campaign has been worked over pretty thoroughly over the past 60, 70, oh, hell, since the end of the war. And what sort of new things did you learn? And secondly, how do you see, when you look at, like, when I used to talk to Carlo Desti when Carlo was doing his work, and one thing that I got from talking to Carlo was how a lot of the inter-allied friction between Montgomery and Eisenhower sort of stems from the experiences they have in North Africa, particularly the disdain that sometimes Montgomery had to the American performance in the field. So I was wondering, if you could comment on those kind of issues.
Well, the first point is it's never been given the significance that it deserves. And I've obviously in the talk, I went through that. The consequences of the campaign were disastrous for the Axis. It leads in relatively short order to the breaking up of the Axis. And you might say, well, you know, for the Germans to lose the Italians is not the worst thing in the world. It was the worst thing in the world if you look at the strategic picture, which is the whole of Southern Europe gets opened up to Western Allied action. And therefore, you've got to put your troops all over the place. The Germans had troops, as we know, in Greece. They had them in Italy. They have them in Sicily. They have them in southern France. I mean, they're terrified that there's going to be an invasion. And of course, ultimately, there was in all of those locations, apart from Greece, of course. But there were fears among the Germans that even Greece could be attacked at some stage. So there were the broader point that I'm trying to make in relation to the book is I don't think it has been acknowledged actually. That what was achieved in North Africa really knocked the Axis as badly as it did in lots of material, but also psychological ways. Going on to the inter-allied frictions, interesting. You can make two arguments about this. You could say, yes, of course, there was a fallout that continued, particularly with Monty all the way through the Normandy campaign. But that was partly Monty's personality. He was going to fall out. He could fall out with someone in a you know, if he's alone in a phone box, as we have a British expression. I mean, he was going to be a difficult customer, but he was also a very effective battlefield commander, as Eisenhower acknowledged at the time. Bradley didn't have such a high opinion of him, nor did Patton, but you know, the feeling was mutual to a certain extent between those protagonists. I think if you look at all the other key players in the story, a lot of the air commanders, for example, they did learn how to fight together. And a lot of the senior staff officers too, who were on Eisenhower's staff, they learned how to work alongside each other. And this was absolutely crucial when it came to the bigger campaign, shall we say, in terms of numbers. And obviously nothing's bigger than D-Day later on. And yes, there was, you know, as I say, there's always going to be friction with someone like Monty. But nevertheless, most of the people lower down the scale, particularly the staff, I think they learned how to fight very effectively together. You had some wonderful commanders on both sides, naval, air, and of course ground commanders. And it is telling, I think, that all the senior Western Allied commanders for the rest of the war cut their teeth in North Africa.
You know, it's funny because I would say that the strategic histories that are written by the United States and Britain about this campaign, I'm thinking of Michael Howard's great volume on grand strategy, they all emphasize the kind of point you're making. I guess part of this issue, I guess, is the permutation of this into the popular consciousness.
Exactly.
Because when you read the British official history, which I have, the American official history, which I have, and follow all these debates going back into the 50s, they did emphasize the very points you raised in the first comment you made back to me. And it's sort of interesting that we're still having this kind of misconception about this campaign. It's sort of interesting to me.
You know what this reminds me of? When I was doing my PhD, and this is going back to 19th century history on the origins of the Indian Rebellion and the significance of the fighting there, is that a lot of the points I was making in my PhD were returning to arguments that had been made immediately after the fighting, and yet that had been lost in all the politics and all the popular story, as you say, the popular perception, which was very much driven, of course, by Indian historians. So it is that is something that how can I put it? Hybrid historians like myself, who have an academic background, but also try and write for a general audience, we're always battling against what we know is sort of already out there, but it hasn't entered the public consciousness. So yes, of course, historians, yourself included, Jim, are well aware of some of the points I'm making. But generally speaking, that is
no, you're right.
not being considered to be as significant as I think it deserves to be.
Yeah, no, you're right. You got to sell a book too, man. But anyway, thanks, man.
Thank you, Jim. We'll take a few more in the queue. I'll go Brandon, Mike, Gary, Mark. Brandon, you're up. If you could unmute your line and ask your question.
Hi, just curious, this is a little bit speculative, but given what happened at Kasserine, and when I read Rick Atkinson's description of it, I came away with the opinion that it was an utter shambles. So it's good to hear your point of view. But if the United States had got its way and there was an invasion of the continent, really anywhere, on Normandy or elsewhere, in
Yeah.
1943, can we look at Kasserine and say, ugh, the likely outcome would have been ugly? Or how do you evaluate that?
Yeah, I think it would have been very ugly. I mean, we also know that there were delicate moments in the actual Normandy campaign, by which time we had complete air superiority. We had all the advantages of the stuff that wouldn't have been available in 1943. I mean, it's interesting that Anderson, who comes out of my story not that well, and it's probably not a coincidence he's never given another command. There was a moment where he's on a knife edge of being sacked, but Anderson makes the point. A lot of the things like the Pluto pipeline, Mulberry Harbors, simply wouldn't have been available in 1943. And that's just the kit we're taking with us. Think of the strength of the Germans in 1943 compared to 1944. Think of the extra air power they would have had if it hadn't been frittered away in North Africa much earlier. So the decision was taken, as I explained in the talk, very early on, to pretty much mothball. They hadn't said there's not going to be an invasion in 1943, but they had pretty much accepted if we're going to go for Sicily, there's only so much landing craft to go around. This was an issue, as everybody knows, right the way through the war. Landing craft, of course, were in demand everywhere, particularly in the Pacific. So there was only a certain amount of, and they still reckoned, of course, in early 1943 that they simply didn't have enough troops based in the UK, built up in the UK, to actually make a successful invasion. So if we accept the argument that even in 1944 it was a close-ish run thing, it would have been, in my view, it would have been a disaster in 1943, and it could have set the Western Allies back an awful long way, and that would have had a knock-on effect on the Soviets and how far they're going to get into Western Europe. And you can get into all kinds of other interesting counterfactual arguments, which is not a game I typically like playing, but it is interesting when you think about the timing for D-Day. If we'd gone in 1943, only a lot of bad things would have resulted because of that, in my view.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brendan. Mike, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Yes, can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Loud and clear, yeah.
Jolly good. Okay, all right. Well, first of all, I just wanted just brief comments and then two questions. Patton was known by many, including myself, is thought of as having been a excellent tactician, but a terrible strategist. And also the fact that there were British officers who did get along, or it would eventually known to be getting along with the Americans. I mean, Horrocks, who was quite effective in North Africa, and even to a large extent Alexander. But my questions, there's two questions. One, you said, I mean, earlier on in this in the part of the campaign that you were covering, that Rommel had 160 tanks total. At some point. And I was just wondering, excuse me, what the bloody hell he was going to do with 160 tanks in an on an offensive level. That, I mean, it would have seemed, even if he had broken through in Kasserine Pass, if he had 160 tanks at that point, even if he had gone further than he with the breakthrough, I mean, it just didn't seem like he could have offensively gotten that far. And then, of course, it would have been his lines of communication and his logistics. That would be the first question. In other words, what was their total tank force actually, and how they were going to manage that. And the second question has to do with something that's not often discussed, which is the general health of the competing armies. Montgomery was pretty well, I think, should be lauded for the fact that he improved the health of the British 8th Army when he took over command. And I was just wondering, as far as the healthiness, their general health, how that might have affected their fighting ability and therefore the entire campaign.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting point. I mean, on the tank issue first, they obviously had a lot more tanks before the Kasserine campaign began because they lost a lot in that campaign. But what I also didn't really have a chance to go into any details. A lot of fighting is going on further north. I mean, one of the things that's infuriating Rommel is von Arnim is carrying out campaigns and actions much further north, and he's frittering away armored strength, particularly the Tiger tank. Now, maybe there were only about 30 or 40 Tiger tanks in North Africa in total, but nevertheless, as a striking power, Rommel asked for them and was never given a single Tiger tank. So none of the actions that Rommel's fighting in the Tunisian campaign actually involves Tiger tanks, which could have been a game changer in a kind of striking force. They are kept rather jealously by von Arnim, and they're frittered away in fighting up north. So, I mean, this is entirely off the top of my head because no one's actually, I haven't seen these figures, but the total tank strength before the Kasserine fighting would probably have been in the region of about 300, maybe more than that. And a lot of those were either kept back by von Arnim or they were lost, as I say, in the fighting. So, by the time you get to Medellin, there's no question that the battle the battle is going to be lost. Really, I think Rommel does it almost to make the point to Hitler: look, you know, we gave it our best shot, but it hasn't been successful. And now, can you let me withdraw the remaining forces? Panzer Army, you know, the Army Group Africa, as it had been dubbed, and was only known for a relatively short period of time. On the issue of health, I mean, I think the Germans were having increasing problems with supplying their troops. So if health was an issue, it was really beginning to degrade the ability of the Germans and the Italians to fight later on in the campaign, because they were really being squeezed on supplies, particularly in the last couple of months of the campaign, and maybe especially the last month, for the obvious reasons that our naval and air effectively embargo of Tunisia was becoming increasingly successful. It's also the reason why actually once you get past mid-March, certainly late March, it would have been almost impossible to have carried out a large evacuation also for the same reasons. On the other hand, fighting in the mountains was incredibly debilitating. When you read some of the first-hand accounts of experiences, particularly for the American soldiers fight, I quote, not in any huge detail, but I quote the conditions for some of them in the mountains. I mean, this is a terribly difficult campaign to fight. I didn't really talk about topography, actually. I should have done, you know, and also climate, because it's winter they're fighting in. It's the end of the year. It's wet and it's cold, and they're fighting up in the mountains in not huge altitude, but maybe at 600 or 800 feet. And those are very, very difficult conditions to survive in unless you've got really good supply lines that are being constantly replenished. And that wasn't necessarily the case because it was very difficult to get supplies to the troops. So both sides were struggling, I would say, by April. But the advantage the Western Allies had is, yes, you had 8th Army, which was a relatively fit army, certainly experienced. There's a lovely description where the two army meets. I mean, one of them, well, the first army with the US 2 Corps attached is, you know, they're relatively white in terms of their kit. They were all beautifully turned out. They all had new uniforms. 8th Army bronze from all their fighting in the desert, but, you know, just wearing tattered clothing because they've been fighting in the campaign for so long.
Thank you very much. Thanks for great answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Gary, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Hi, thanks. No, so first I would like to really applaud you for the most balanced account of the actions there that generally go by the name of Battle of Kasserine Pass that I've seen in print. I think, you know, and it's there's this legend that's developed about the disaster at Kasserine Pass, and obviously there were some definite problems, especially just before that and during that battle and afterwards. But it's so one-sided, and yours was very balanced, and I really enjoyed reading it. I actually read some of your book last night. But I would have to say that on the whole idea of comparing this favorably to Stalingrad, I think is a little misleading. That a lot of the troops that were surrendered were Italians, not the highest fighting value, and a lot of them weren't even military. They were civilian administrators. And I think you also mentioned Goebbels' diaries, which, yeah, he does acknowledge that it was a big, the losses were painful, but he praises Hitler for having tied up the Allies for another year by committing additional forces there. And I think that's often you hear the argument that Hitler erred in sending extra forces like 10th Panzer and part of the like 3 other divisions there. But I don't think people really evaluate properly that if he hadn't sent those extra, there's a high probability that the Tunisian campaign would have wrapped up in December at the latest, or maybe early January. And that puts a whole another dimension to the possibilities of what the Allies could do. Anyway, that's a long story, and I'm not going to get into that. But
Yeah,
I just want you to comment on that, what I just said there. But the incremental value, yes, I mean, if he has to send them, and they do take Tunisia in December, yeah, it's not going to be 250,000, but it's going to be probably 2/3 of that, which represents the Rommel's command that probably would have been taken in Libya. So anyway.
The first, well, possibly, and then maybe even Hitler might have thought, well, you know, they've got no chance. We need to at least try and get them out. And there certainly were opportunities. I mean, what's fascinating about the start of the Tunisian campaign is how easily the Axis, how easy it is for the Axis to get vast numbers of troops into North Africa. And if you can get them there, you can get them away. But no, just to set you straight on numbers, there were more Germans captured in Tunisia than Italians. So it's not as though you heard the quote from Goebbels. You've kind of tried to belittle it. Actually, he says this is a catastrophe. Okay, don't kid yourselves. What has just happened to us is a catastrophe. A lot of our best people are there, and that's the other point. A lot of veteran troops were over there. What you see fighting on the Eastern Front, even by 1943, certainly by 1944, is really low grade, poor quality troops. I mean, when troops are captured during the, I've been writing about all of this, so I'm sort of moving on to the next stage of the story. But when troops are captured in Operation Bagration, particularly in and around in Belarus, Russia, they're paraded through the streets of Moscow in this kind of, you know, almost like Roman triumph. And these descriptions of what they look like, you know, half of them are wearing glasses, they're quite old. I mean, these are really, really poor quality troops. And that was fairly typical for the Eastern Front. Where are their best quality troops? Obviously not all of them, but a lot of their really good people have been lost in North Africa. And I think that's the point Rommel's trying to make, is that let's get these guys out, because you've got people who have been learning the business of fighting, veterans under me for the last 2 years, and you're just going to throw them away for a strategic objective which is never going to be achieved. That is holding on to. Now, yes, of course, preventing the invasion of Southern Europe, possibly, maybe even Northwest Europe for another year is an advantage. But if, for example, we had captured North Africa, which is what the intention was, by Christmas of 1942, that still doesn't mean conditions are right for an invasion of Northwest Europe in 1943. They almost certainly are not. So the idea that this is actually, you know, save the Germans for another year, I'm not buying that for a second. What Hitler did is throw away some very, very good troops. And by the way, the Italians, although not all of them were great, they had some very, very good troops there, armored troops and also mountain troops. All of whom were lost in the fighting. So no, I think you've got to read it from, yes, of course, we were saying it's a great success, but the Germans are not calling their own campaign Tunisgrad for no reason. They know it's hugely significant. And the loss for Mussolini, yes, it's partly psychological, but it also has it does real damage to Hitler too. And so no, I stand by my argument. I'm not saying it's more significant than Stalingrad, but I am saying it's another real game changer, which has not been properly acknowledged up to this point.
Great, thanks, Gary. Mark, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Yeah. First of all, thank you very much for the presentation. This is an interesting topic. I have two questions. One is very quick, and then the other one's a little bit more complex. First one, of the 250,000 troops that were lost, how many were German exactly? How many were Italian? And the more complex question is, at the time when Rommel had told Hitler, hey, we have to withdraw, and Hitler says no. If he had made the other decision to say, okay, let's do that, given the Allied maritime and air, not supremacy, but power, how much could the Germans have withdrawn? I mean, frankly,
Yeah,
at that
well,
point.
good question. We'll never know for sure. And as I say, the closer you get to the end of the campaign,
Yes.
and we know that the conversation took place, I think, specifically on the 11th of March. So there is still an opportunity to get some back at that stage because they're still pouring. They're still pouring men and material in. And by the way, it's not just the loss of the men, of course. It's the planes. I already spoke about the planes that were lost in this campaign, but also enormous amounts of supplies were lost in the campaign. Specifically, to answer your question about numbers in terms of the people who were captured, roughly 130,000. So it's a slight majority of Germans to Italians, and about 120,000 Italians were captured in that final. Goebbels talks about 150,000. I think it was a slight exaggeration, but of course they'd taken a lot of casualties up to this point. So yes, how many could they have got away if he'd have listened to Rommel? We'll never know, but certainly a chunk of them could have got away at that point, probably not all of them. But it is interesting, I didn't have a chance to talk about this, that Rommel actually goes back to talk to Hitler, and this time in the Wolf's Lair in late November. This is before the campaigns even really got going properly. And he says then, effectively hints that the chances of holding on to North Africa now that the Americans and the British have landed in French North Africa are minimal, and that Hitler at least needs to consider the possibility. He's not having anything, he's obviously not agreeing to it then. So, but in Rommel's mind, there's no chance of winning in North Africa, and the best thing we can do is get our best people out. We'll never know for sure, but certainly some of them, a chunk of them. I'd go so far as to say at that stage in mid-March, you've still got another 6 weeks of the campaign to go, 6 or 7 weeks of the campaign to go. They could have got a significant number out, I would have thought, at that stage.
So you're talking tens of thousands, a few divisions?
I would say more than half. I mean,
More than half. Okay.
I mean, and of course you've got the casualties. So probably you're talking about a total force. Admittedly, they were reinforcing them, so it's hard to know. But you're probably talking about a total force at that stage of about 300,000, let's say, when the two armies meet up. So maybe you can get out a half. But again, it's pure speculation on my part.
Yeah.
For sure.
But didn't they lose so much air power going in? There was I remember, isn't there a particular day when the Allied fighters chewed up a lot of Ju-52s?
Yeah, that's taking, but that makes my point. They're still trying to send troops in. This is the end of April you're talking about, so this is the last 2 or 3 weeks of the campaign. And
that's okay. Sorry. Okay, I thought that was before. Okay, sorry.
Well, I mean, maybe there was another incident before, but the famous loss of the Ju-88s bringing in troops takes place in this absolute bloodbath, which I think I mentioned in the book, round about the end of April. So they're still doubling down on trying to bring in men and supplies, even at that late stage.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. So there's 1 or 2 questions in the queue. Tom asked if the 250,000 German troops went to southern France, as Rommel advised, would D-Day, would the outcome have been different?
Yeah, well, that's the point, isn't it? And that's what Rommel was saying. I don't think they'd have put all of them into southern France, but they'd have a lot more veteran troops to defend Sicily, to defend Italy, to defend Greece, and also southern France too. I mean, remember that when the D-Day campaign actually opens, the Germans have a serious superiority in terms of the numbers in that theatre. Where they don't have them, of course, is in Normandy, and they don't have the heavy striking power, which are the panzer divisions, because there's been a disagreement. Well, the subterfuge of the invasion plans worked very effectively, of course, in making the Germans convinced that it's going to be Pas de Calais, and this is actually a sideshow, just an attempt to disguise where they're actually going to land. And so, yes, if you've got more veteran troops available to defend southern France, then you've got more people available to defend northern France. I mean, it goes without saying. You've also got, by the way, more people to stiffen the Eastern Front, which was really, really flimsy by this point. By D-Day, I'm talking about. I mean, really shocking. I've just been writing about it. It's absolutely shocking, the quality and the number. I mean, fighters alone, they only had about 500 fighters for the whole of the Eastern Front by the start of Operation Bagration. And people talk about, I don't want to get on a rant here, but they talk about the great success of Soviet arms. Well, literally, they were pushing against a door that was bound to swing open because there was nothing really left on the Eastern Front. Hitler, interestingly, as I'm sure a lot of the listeners viewers will know, was banking on defeating the Western allies. It's really extraordinary how fixated he was on that. And one of the arguments is, well, of course, the big demons are the Americans, because they've come in on this, and the Americans and it's Wall Street and the whole sort of Jewish conspiracy is going on there, and if only we can defeat them. He's always thinking, actually, once I've defeated the West, I can turn on the East, and the Soviets are not going to be much of a problem. Of course, they were a big problem by 1944, but the forces that he leaves on the Eastern Front, particularly the air cover, will give you an indication of how low down his priorities were in terms of the immediate strategic objectives of the Wehrmacht by 1944.
No, that's an excellent answer. I just want to close on a lighter note because there's a few questions on Hollywood and movies, just specifically that scene in Patton, George C. Scott, where he says, "Rommel, I read your book, you magnificent SOB." Do you think there's any truth to that? And is there any movie you like that you think portrays this campaign reasonably accurately?
I've never heard a story about Patton that I hadn't thought wasn't possible to be truthful, because some of the comments he makes in his diaries. I mean, a lot of us have read the diaries either in their original form. You don't really need to because they're all digitized now. I mean, really, the comments he's coming out with are just astonishing. So no, I mean, he's a wonderful character, of course, for Hollywood, because he really was larger than life. He did say a lot of those things, or he said something similar, or he said something worse. He was incredibly denigrating about pretty much everyone. He has a sort of grudging respect for Eisenhower, but no sort of faith in his ability as a field commander, as indeed very few of the other people who served under Ike did too. But no, I mean, I just, it was wonderful to be able to write about Patton for the first time in this book. And of course, he's going to come into, well, he has come into the story already in my follow-up book. So, it's, if history can throw you real people who actually say these sorts of things, it really enlivens the narrative beautifully. And if Hollywood are going to nick some of those stuff and I don't know, even embellish on them, we shouldn't be surprised. But Patton, to be truthful, wasn't someone you needed to embellish.
Absolutely. Any movie you like, you think does the campaign justice?
It's tricky. I mean, some of the desert fighting, I think, is told beautifully in. I'm trying to remember the actual film where they portray Rommel so beautifully in the desert fighting. It must be the Desert Fox I'm thinking of. Yes, yeah. Of course. So my Desert Fox is my favorite, but it doesn't really, that's not, well, of course, it ultimately goes on to Tunisia, but it is a lot about the fighting in Egypt and Libya too. So yeah, that would probably be my favorite film in relation to the North African fighting.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Saul, for a great lecture and Q&A. Again, the book is Tunisgrad, Victory in Africa by Saul David. It is available in March in the US, but you can pre-order it now on Amazon. Please join us this Tuesday evening, December 9th at 8 p.m. when historian Sean Kozol will discuss his latest book, Under the Red Banner, A History of the 43rd Guards Tank Brigade, which traces the daily actions of the Soviet tank unit throughout World War II, including in well-known battles, including Smolensk, Moscow, Operation Bagration, and East Prussia, as well as some of the East Front's forgotten battles, such as Operation Mars, Orsha, and Vitebsk, which I'm sure I will need to pronounce. Thank you. Hopefully you can join us, and thank you for joining us this afternoon, certainly to our speaker in the audience, and we hope to see everyone on Tuesday. Take care. Thank you very much, Saul. That was a wonderful.
Great.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.